Hi, welcome. Before we start the event, we'd just like to take a quick 1-minute silence for Her late Majesty the Queen. Thank you. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever Hot Topics panel hosted by the IET London Young Professionals Network. My name is Amila, one of the organisers of the event, and we're delighted to have you all here in our first in-person event since the pandemic. This is the first of hopefully many more Hot Topics to come, and we're very excited to be sharing this with the Institute of Civil Engineers. So for those who are unfamiliar with the ICE, they're a very established institution that have been supporting civil engineers for over 200 years. Civil engineers play an important role in our everyday lives, and so they work towards supporting them with the tools to develop them professionally through opportunities to learn and share knowledge like today. It's a privilege to be part of this collaboration, and we couldn't be more thankful for the support they've given to this event, so thank you very much. So to not be delayed any further, I'll introduce our host for tonight. So our host was the winner of the IET's Young Women Engineer of the Year Award in 2020. She's been named Surrey's Top 40 Under 40 in 2022, and more recently received an NBE in Her Majesty the Queen's late birthday honours award for her contributions to engineering, innovation and diversity. So with that, I introduce and leave you all in the capable hands of your host, Ella Podmore.
Thank you. And I'll tell you what, it's quite nice to be this side of the panel for once, where I get to ask all of you lot the questions. But yeah, it's an honour to be here, guys, and to host what is a really important topic. Climate change has become more pressing matter as we've been experiencing the detrimental effects of it as we speak. We all have a moral and political responsibility to our planet, and it's been suggested that it's a problem that has been lacking a combined effort. But climate change is everyone's problem. So with that in mind, we have a diverse panel of experts in different areas of the problem, and we're here today to have an open discussion on how to work together. So without further ado, let's meet our panellists. Firstly, guys, thank you for giving up your time and being here. I'm really excited to hear some of your opinions on our questions that we're going to ask. I'm going to introduce a question, potentially ask one of you to start answering the question, but if you have something to add, feel free to jump in. We want it to be an open discussion, and we want to have almost a conversation style. So, first and foremost, Ollie Haddon, the first panellist here. Ollie is a sustainability coordinator at Foster's & Partners, holding a Masters of Engineering and a Masters in Science in Civil Engineering and Sustainable Design and Construction from the Universities of Warwick and Loughborough. He currently advises holistic sustainability and embodied carbon strategy for building and master plan projects globally, with a particular focus on curricular economy. Next, we have Paul Longe, and Paul is an engineer working as a contractor for the Ministry of Defence with a passion for sustainability and renewable energies. At university, he completed 2 first-class projects, one on sustainable robotics and another in a team on a concept called airborne wind energy. Post-graduation, he took forward his project to become the first ever president in 10 champion for the IET with a presentation called Why I Love Kites and You Should Too. Our third panellist is Cameron Archer-Jones. Cameron is a principal bridge engineer from Covey with an increasing focus on carbon management in infrastructure. He is a sustainability leader from Covey in the UK for embodied carbon, and he is also the chair of a working group on carbon data and benchmarking for the Net Zero Bridges Group. Our fourth panellist is Michaela Chan. Michaela Chan holds a BA and a Master's in Engineering in Civil, Structural and Environmental Engineering from the University of Cambridge. She's also a civil engineer at Arcadis, working in the water sector. She serves as the UK Youth Delegate for Sustainable and Livable Planet to the Y20 Indonesia 2022, contributing to public policy recommendations which represent the voice of the youth to be shared with G20 leaders. Our fifth and final panellist is Dr. Toby Alusakin. Toby is a sustainability consultant, researcher and project manager with 8 years' experience in delivering energy, climate and environmental management programs in the public and private sector. He has written articles for several high-quality journals, conferences and websites, and has presented his research at multiple industry-leading conferences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panellists. Hello? Perfect. I'm going to come and sit down here to make it more of a conversation style. But first, if we go through what we're going to do today. So we've got 2 sessions. We started at 7, and we're going to run this session through till about 7:45. We'll then let you lovely people have a break for about half an hour. You can have some food, a bit of drink, and some networking. And then we'll start our session 2 at 8:15. This will run on until 8:45, where we'll have a Q&A session for half an hour, and then networking at the end from 9:15. So with the Q&A, guys, if it's easier, we've put out notepads on your tables, so feel free to grab a pen, write down questions you may have throughout. These can be collected in the break, or we can have a mic being passed around at the end. So there's plenty of ways to get questions to us. Make sure you get them down if you want them answered. Without further ado, shall we begin? So, session 1, and we're going to start with a question. Is decarbonisation a detrimental term for net zero? Do we focus too much on carbon emissions and lose sight of other contributors to the issue? Good question, and I'm going to come to Michaela to answer this first. What are your thoughts on the word decarbonisation? Is it a bad term?
So net zero, obviously, as most people in the room probably know, just means that we are emitting the same number of greenhouse gases as we are taking out of it. And obviously, the only greenhouse gas isn't just carbon, so I do think the term decarbonisation is a bit limiting. In terms of the actual effects of different greenhouse gases, carbon does stay in the atmosphere for the longest compared to methane and others like nitrous oxide. So tackling carbon emissions would do a lot towards tackling climate change, and I think that as an industry and just as a planet, we still aren't doing enough to actually decarbonise. So I don't think it's necessarily limiting us in tackling climate change, because it is something that we need to be doing, but at the same time, we shouldn't limit our scope to decarbonisation. We need to look at other greenhouse gases. So, for example, last year at COP, there was the methane agreement and the methane pledge from all the different countries to reduce methane by 30%, which was groundbreaking because it was the first time anyone ever actually talked about some other greenhouse gas. And I think when you recognise that, you can start recognising the contributions that other industries can have. For example, agriculture is trying to do a lot to reduce methane as well. And I think we need to start taking a more interdisciplinary approach to climate change. And so, I don't know, I would say keep using decarbonisation, but also don't just look at carbon.
Thank you. Anyone else got anything to contribute to decarbonisation? Yes, Cameron?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think immediately your interpretation of decarbonisation is quite different, I think, to me. Because in literature and sort of in discussion, if anyone says carbon, I will always consider that to be carbon equivalents of the set of greenhouse gases. So my initial reading of the question was more that the focus on decarbonisation I thought was a benefit as opposed to net zero, because net zero allows offsetting to creep in your sort of overall focus, whereas if you go for decarbonisation, I think you're going more towards an absolute zero level, which is certainly, the most effective thing we can do now.
Yes, Toby.
2 cents on that one.
Thank you.
I same interpretation of the question as you did. When I think of decarbonization, I'm thinking not just of carbon, but the other culprits to warming and climate change. And in that, say, decarbonization as a term, while I agree that it's sort of, for the layman, yeah, sorry about that. For the layman, it creates a misinterpretation of the word itself. You know, people just think it might just have to do with only carbon, but then it also puts together everything in a neat little bow, you know, to help people to talk about it, to try to.
See if that's anywhere. There you go.
So it ties everything up in a neat little bow. It helps people talk about it. It helps us have these kind of discussions. You know, it's a bit more difficult when you're thinking about decarbonization, demethanization, and all the refrigerants, refrigerant gases and things like that. So it ties everything up in a neat little bow to help with that understanding. But then it's also important to educate people to let them understand that it's not just carbon. There are other gases out there that actually cause quite a bit of harm in the environment. So that's pretty much my 2 cents.
I've got. I'd agree with that. I'd agree. I know. I think, if we're saying carbon, sort of very generally, discussion is a equivalent of carbon equivalent emissions of all greenhouse gases. I think it's exactly what we need to be doing. I think it can be seen as the Trojan horse of sustainability, because we need a metric that is simple, it's robust, that we can measure, we can regulate, and we can set in briefs so people will do it. And I think it's on the way there, but there are gaps missing. I think Cameron might agree, it's sort of not the most robust metric, but I think it could be the one that will get us to where governments can regulate it and ensure that projects are going after something, because I think without a single simple metric, it's a bit all over the place, and you can sort of get greenwashing and into sort of territory where nothing really happens. So I think, but there are other metrics, as you said, things like ecological footprint that looks at not just emissions, but sort of balance of sources and sinks to consider more wider than just carbon.
I mean, it's interesting. If companies are using decarbonisation, do you guys think that there is a better way to market what they're doing, contributing towards a sustainable future? I mean, you kind of hinted upon some of the phrases, the words that they could use as an alternative. Is there anything that you guys would suggest that would probably, instead of referencing decarbonisation, is there anything else that they can be marketing to sort of say, hey, we're doing good in this world, but we don't actually want to all box it into this particular term?
I think decarbonisation is actually one of the best terms that we have. Okay. When you look at all of the greenhouse gases, what actually contributes, H2O is kind of a big one, but that's not something that we're looking to solve. It's not a man-made impact. So when we focus on decarbonisation, we're putting out effort so we can have the biggest impact. And when we start to add in other terms, that adds more complexity and can make it a little bit harder for the public to actually see what's going on. Mm-hmm. But by reducing our focus into the biggest hitters, as a society, we're able to improve and go down the correct routes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, panellists. We okay to move on? Anything else? No. Okay, so question number 2. Is it feasible to balance cutting carbon costs with our own living costs? More relevant than ever, I think. How will the introduction of new technologies and policies affect the cost of living? So, Ollie, I'm going to come straight to you on this one.
Yes, I think it's definitely very feasible for technologies like renewables to, in the long run, cut costs hugely with cheap energy. Right now we're hugely susceptible to the global market price of wholesale gas, which is setting energy prices. If we, through some political will, become energy independent and can generate a lot of our own energy without reliance on or flux of global markets, I think definitely. But complicated with getting these policies in place when, political agendas that have long-term thinking are difficult to get elected. And so getting them in place, getting the investment and getting away from the fossil fuels is the difficult part.
Yeah.
But the theory of renewables in the long term will definitely be cheaper and more independent and security-wise better, I think.
Yeah, I can add on to that one. I think renewables are absolutely the way to reducing living costs. When we look at the global market right now, I think a lot of renewables, as more investment and time goes into them, and we invest into that infrastructure, they reduce in price. If you look at the levelized cost of electricity, a lot of renewables already, I'm thinking solar and wind, when used at a large scale, are cheaper than a lot of our fossil fuels. And when you just look at the name renewable means it's something that we can use again and again, whereas fossil fuels and those polluting ways of generating energy are running out. So if you look at the long-term, whether financially or on the impact on the planet, renewables are absolutely the way to go. And I think even in the short term, we have developing countries which in the past have relied more on fossil fuels. They've been able to switch over and start to use renewable technologies. That's because as developing countries have made those investments and made innovations and found ways to improve efficiency, we're able to give that to developing countries and they can use that economic advantage. If we look over the past, I think in the past decade, batteries alone have improved in efficiency by about 60%. We look over the past 30 years, they've improved in efficiency by 97%. So we can already see how quickly technology can leapfrog. And I don't know what the next innovation is going to be, but if we continue to invest in education, people continue to do things like this and gain interest in the environment, we can always move forward and maybe find that next innovation that can help us to leapfrog.
It's interesting, I think, that the point that a part of it though is how you get there. And if you live in a place like the UK where a lot of infrastructure is actually built with private funding, how do you create a policy lever that encourages it into more sustainable sort of energy infrastructure? So I think sort of an increase to cost through a carbon tax or something like that is one of, maybe it's a blunt weapon, but it's probably one of the only that if you're in policy that you could really say from a high level to try and push it towards. And I think that I've seen it, I was living in Australia when they tried to bring in a carbon tax and the government got voted out because of it. Because the end conclusion that was run through to the public was that this would lead to an increase in your costs of living. So all the big businesses that had to pay the tax were just going to pass over that additional expenditure for this tax onto the consumer, so the public. So it actually completely didn't work. The government got voted out very quickly and then they removed it and sort of went with something very light touch for a long time. So I don't know, I feel like you have to have the threat of an increased cost to really push private investment in a direction you want. I think it's maybe a bit naive to think that it's going to happen without some sort of economic push. The hard part is making sure that's not going to the consumer. It has to be sort of, this is well beyond my experience, but I think setting up a policy like that is very complicated to get it to work the way you want.
Absolutely.
I think there is, one more on that, is that one really big positive that, is gaining a lot of steam is what people do with their pensions and going to pension providers and say, I don't want anything in a fossil fuel related, invested in fossil fuel companies, because they're normally buried in, funds and funds and funds that if you try and trace it, and I try and did it for my work's pension fund a few months ago, and it's extremely difficult. They can't tell you what it's invested in, but it's likely got something in there. And it was only after a lot of lobbying that I was able to sort of get more info and then sort of take it out and move it to something else.
That's a really useful tip. Michaela, did you have something?
Yeah, so this is more from the policy side, but I read a report about comparing different government energy and cost of living policy scenarios, which compared the worst case, the policies that the government is currently committed to, and a climate positive case, which was kind of what they're committed to now, plus short-term spending to kind of safeguard certain households from falling into debt from changing the energy mix that we're using, and also to protect currently already vulnerable households, plus like medium-term funding on more sustainable public transport, energy efficiency and everything. And like there were clear results which showed that the first two all three of them in the short term led to an improvement in the cost of living and in tackling carbon. But in the long term, between 2025 and 2050, only the climate positive scenario actually increased GDP. And that was just through creation of jobs in like green energy and other green jobs, but also just the fact that overall the cost of living ends up decreasing and households have more disposable income to spend to increase economic growth in the country. And I think that I really agree with the point that you guys have been making about like government short-termism, but I think that we can maybe hope that governments will eventually start talking about long-termism. I know there was like that really controversial speech from Boris Johnson at Savoy, which everyone picked up on him talking about everyone buying a kettle for £20 or something. But he was actually making a really good point if you watch the entire speech, which was that governments are doing a really bad job now. They're focusing on what they need right now to win an election, but they need to think further for the good of the country, because I think with something like climate change, if we don't start thinking more long-term, then there will be a lot of costs for the future government. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anything to add, Toby? Do you want to give that mic a go?
Let's try that again. Okay,
yeah.
So I'm just going to add to what they mentioned on renewable energy technologies. Usually when we're looking towards decarbonisation and towards going towards net zero, the easiest way to start on that is usually through energy efficiency. And there are several energy efficiency-based technologies that can be implemented that help to cut carbon as well as cost of living in terms of, at the very least, within the context of this cost of living crisis. If you look at policies, for example, like the Green Homes Grant, these are very popular policies that actually put money in the pockets of actual people to help to renovate their homes in a way that help to reduce cost of fuel and cost of energy, which in turn improves or reduces the cost of living as well, and takes people out of that fuel poverty or energy poverty state. So I would say, in addition to looking at the long-termism, if I can use that term, even in the short term and the medium term, there are different technologies and policies that can be enacted, that some of them actually have been enacted, that actually help to both cut carbon and reduce the cost of living.
Thank you. Some really, really useful tips from you guys there. Do you think that these policies are advertised enough? I mean, to me, I'm sort of thinking, Christ, I should really have a look at my own policy. You're doing some really, really amazing work telling us about it, but are they advertised enough? Should we be doing more? Should they be government-led?
Just starting on that, some of them are. There are some really easy ones to advertise. So, for example, when you're actually putting money in people's pockets, it's really easy to get people to listen and take notice. So some of those are easy to advertise. And I would say, on the other hand, I think the government has probably not done the best job in understanding how to market some of these policies to people to help them to understand the benefit, even if the benefit is only in the long term, to help them understand the benefit, especially example at this time in terms of energy security. A lot of people are up in arms about what the short-term increase in costs might be in relation to the UK's investment in homegrown energy sources, but then in the long term it does help with that cost of living crisis and cost of energy.
It may be kind of a silver lining with the living costs being so high, like you were alluding to, Toby, people starting to turn down the thermometer or maybe starting to shut the windows and turn the lights off better, but really interesting. Thank you. So next question, can we really quantify how much improvement we can make to the environment? Will industries adopting different methods to quantify environmental impact make it more difficult to collaborate? Cameron, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What do you have to say?
Okay. There's stacks of ways you could cut this question. I think at a if we start at a project level, like an engineering style project that most of us would be working on, I would say definitely yes. I'd say the restriction should not be at the moment, are we using the right method or are we, following the right guide? I would actually say just doing something is better than nothing. Particularly in a civil engineering context, it is a very traditional industry, and this is something new, which in construction can take a while to sort of filter through to the levels that's mature enough such that it is considered something just like a safety risk assessment or something like that. That's the level where I think we need to get to. So I would say with that sort of focus, definitely. And again, with a standard engineer's desk scope of work that they could be working on, that impact can be quite considerable, like orders of magnitude more than in a personal capacity. And that's something that myself and colleagues at Covey, we've really been pushing, to sort of just do a calc. It doesn't matter how perfect it is, but if you have a start, then you can start to refine it and get better. At a national level, I think, and connecting the project to national is a particular challenge at the moment. I know through discussions with contractors and government bodies like National Highways, there's a bit of a disconnect between the carbon budgets at national level and how that filters down to major road and rail projects. So we worked for a long time on Lower Thames Crossing, which is currently out for tender, as the client's engineer. And through the discussion, establishing what a budget should be has been very difficult, but what projects are starting to do quite well is have a reference design, calculate the footprint for the reference design, and then set targets to reduce it. And what we expect is in the future that the government bodies, as well as being given monetary budgets for building new infrastructure, they will also get a carbon budget. Right. And if the project's falling outside of it, then they'll be forced to either ask internally for more, or they'll have to, delay it, like what you would do with money, basically. So, yeah, I guess that's the takeaway. Is that firstly, we have to start something. I wouldn't worry so much about us doing slightly different methods. But yeah, looking further ahead, you can see how if one approach favours something that a different approach doesn't, and then you're trying to get, say, a designer or a contractor to both do something positive, but they're measuring it differently and then sort of favouring different decisions, then that could be problematic. But I'd say that'd be a nice problem to have. At the moment, it's normally like, where do we start?
Thank you. Anyone else got anything to add to that? Yes, Paul.
To that one, I guess kind of like a question and a challenge to a lot of companies. When you try and do these calculations on how much carbon you're producing, you always have to kind of look back at other companies and say, what you're importing, what's their carbon emissions? And what I'd really like to see is a bit more clarity on that. And I would like all companies to actually produce that data and be really clear about it. And I think that links into this question on how do you quantify it? And if others quantify it differently, then you will have a difficulty collaborating. And when it comes to solving such a massive issue like carbon emissions and reaching net zero, collaboration is the most important factor.
Thank you.
I think, in the building industry, I mean, it's probably further along than infrastructure or other engineering disciplines, but the methodology is in place, how to do a carbon calculation or global warming potential equivalent version. It's in place, it's not perfect, but it's still, definitely in its infancy. And there's a lot of them being done now. There's a lot of working groups working to refine them, to get them better, so that they can really be repeatable, they can be set. And I guess for the second part, industries adopting different methods. I think as long as there is a sort of common denominator between them, that will be easier. And if there's carbon being calculated all over the place, there will be some way to equate it. I mean, countries already have to quantify their environmental impacts. From 2023, every nation will have to submit their carbon impacts if they are signed up with the Paris Agreement, and they will be annually tested, reported, and they will have to update their policies to further meet them. So I think 2023 is when things will really notch up again, and you'll see a lot more put into this for many more industries.
If I can add to that, to the first question, we definitely can quantify how much improvement we make to the environment. There are several metrics by which we can actually do this, not just in relation to carbon, but You've got energy and carbon, you've got biodiversity, you've got water consumption, waste management, several other metrics by which we can actually measure the improvement that we're making toward the environment. So there are ways in which we can actually quantify that. And then to the second question in relation to different industries adopting different methodologies, I would agree with what he said. It's just best to start something at this point. It's just good enough that different industries are actually starting something, and then over time we can basically refine. I would also refer to Science-Based Targets Institute guidance for different industries and different sectors. So there are organizations, the Science-Based Targets Institute is backed by the United Nations, and it's in the process of developing methodologies and guidance for different industries and different sectors to help to measure the move towards net zero carbon. And so there are those movements at the moment towards creating a holistic view or holistic methodology with which different industries would be able to go through to have a common understanding of how to measure some of these things. But then, like you said, it's just about starting at this point, and then over time, I believe with the support that sustainability has around the world, and especially in developed countries, there is motivation to keep improving on those methodologies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a clear point coming across here, I think, that you guys have done so well in highlighting, is that we should expect organisations to be more clear on their policies and their usage, their carbon emissions, and hopefully, I mean, in the long term, if they're providing more clarity on that, then we could be expecting customers to make wise, sustainable choices on who they went with and things. So, yeah, really, really interesting. Okay. Of course, Michaela. Go for it.
It took me a long time to process. So, yeah, I completely agree with what everyone says. I just wanted to add like another side of things, because it talks about quantifying the improvement we make to the environment. And obviously everyone's mentioned metrics because we're all engineers and we love metrics and numbers. But I think there's another side of things as well, which is the social benefit that you get, which is less easily measured. And I think something that we miss as engineers a lot, at least in the industry I work in, I don't know about everyone else, but we don't talk to people enough, like the local communities that are impacted. Like, it's not really a problem in this country, but in other countries, like indigenous peoples whose lives are impacted and who have a much more strong relationship with nature than we necessarily do here. And I think it's important to start also quantifying the value that they see nature having, which can't necessarily be quantified in numbers, but you can like start working towards understanding it.
Do you see that as companies having more of an outreach, like going to these communities and asking the questions? How do you see that being rolled out? So,
I mean, I think that community engagement is really important in a lot of projects, and we usually see our client as like the person paying us to do the project, but I think we need to just also start thinking about our clients as the people who are the end users of our project as well, and not just like, okay, I've been paid by this person, I'm going to build it for this person, I only care about their needs. Yeah. We also need to think across, like all the different silos and talk to people outside of who we would normally talk to, just to make sure we're fully understanding the picture, because when we're talking about climate change, it's a huge systemic change that needs to happen, and I think that needs to come with a change in how we design and how we do our jobs.
Thank you, Michaela. Yeah, really, really good. Question 4. As we move towards renewable technologies, what about our grid infrastructure? Will it be able to handle the load from the strains such as electric vehicle charging at home? I'm going to jump straight to Toby on this one.
I will start by saying I'm not much of an expert in grid infrastructure. So I was saying I'm not much of an expert in grid infrastructure, but I will give my 2 cents on this. I think the answer for me to that question, short answer, is no, not at this time. In terms of the grid infrastructure, I would say it needs to improve in both robustness and flexibility. Robustness in the sense that it needs to be able to take on demand at peak times from different strains. So you have EV charging, like you mentioned. You've got heat pumps going forward. The government is looking to be able to install about 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. And then you've got a lot of other demands on the electric grid. And so the grid has to be robust enough to be able to take on those different strains. And at the moment, things are a bit lacking. A report recently by McKinsey, or the Financial Times, actually talked about how currently there is a 10-year queue for renewable energy developers to be able to connect the development, so that's solar and wind, onto the electric grid, because the grid doesn't have the capacity to take that at the moment. And so there needs to be a lot of investment in grid infrastructure, and it needs to be done quickly to be able to achieve that goal of net zero by 2050. And then when you look at the flexibility aspect of it, in terms of flexibility, we then come to things like smart grids. Now, I personally haven't really been able to see any viable example of smart grids in the UK. I think it's still in development. There are currently over 1,600 smart grid projects going on in the UK. But
what's a smart grid?
So so just to explain that, smart grid is a grid infrastructure that is able to connect renewable energy projects to consumers on the grid. It's able to connect to smart meters, and I would say, in a sense, it's able to connect to smart meters, and through I'm trying to find a good way to. Yes. Yeah, so essentially using data from smart meters to be able to predict demand, and also share that demand through different demand strains. So, for example, you've got the heat pumps, you've got electric vehicle charging as well, and a number of other ways through which demand can be shared. So, at the moment, smart meter technology or smart grid technology is not mature enough to be financially viable, but then it is important to continue to invest in this to enhance the flexibility of the electric grid, essentially. So, in essence, we've got robustness and flexibility as ways in which the electric grid can be improved. But at the moment, it still has a ways to go. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think, as a civil engineer, I plug in an appliance and I turn it on and it works, and that's about my electrical knowledge of the grid. One thing, though, I think where the sort of cross-industry collaboration is starting to work super well is one example we're working on in the Glasgow office is a project called Corrie Glass, which is a huge hydroelectric pump storage dam, where it's taking out the peaks and troughs that will come in the provision and demand for renewables. Yeah. So it pumps up water, when it's windy and people aren't using it, and then it stores it, and when the demand's high, it will release it, and obviously you get your power back. So I think there are those sort of, senior people at work call it sector coupling. I think it's a bit of a buzz term, where you can sort of use infrastructure from different parts to sort of ease demand across the grid at a national level.
Yeah, I can add on to that. In terms of storing, renewable energies are inherently intermittent. They've got all of these peaks and troughs, but in terms of storing that energy for use later, there's loads of technologies which are currently looking at that. There's compressed air energy storage, to name one of them. You just mentioned another kind of energy storage, and I previously said about batteries, how they've improved in efficiency by 60% over the past decade. I think we currently are investing in so many different ways of managing the intermittency of renewables that I kind of see that us connecting it to the grid shouldn't be a problem as we invest in both at the same time. And secondly, when you look at renewables, they also have an interesting opportunity in that they can, in some cases, be decentralized. You go around certain areas and people have got solar panels all over their house. Some of those solar panels, they feed energy back into the grid, but they feed it directly into the house. You don't have to worry about putting strain onto the national grid. So I think renewables, it might be difficult to connect them to the grid as it's currently made now, but we have those technologies available, and the only thing holding us back is investment and a bit of time.
So effectively we're saying that does need to be improvements, but there needs to be active push to make it possible, rather than us sort of saying it's a new technology. Generally, these things are going to work their way into it. Cool.
I think that 10-year figure was quite alarming.
Yeah,
you can't plug in
I
anything in
thought that.
10 years. I don't know if that's Shell putting in a warning sign like invest in something else, but 10 years that's a concern, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, guys, this is our last question before you lovely lot can have a break. So, interested in your opinion on what approach to take to sustainable living. We've kind of touched upon this already, but if you have any other thoughts and feelings, I'd love to know. The technological challenges of integrating renewables into the grid and producing feasible off-grid energy are yet to be solved. So should we completely change the source of our energy, i.e. look to hydrogen power, or focus on reducing the damages of current sources? Paul, I'm going to go to you on this one.
Yeah, I kind of started to answer this a bit on the previous question, but I can add on a few more points. So I think one of the things that we kind of need to look for at the moment is stopgaps. We can't rely on our current carbon-emitting energy sources like coal or oil, and we really need to focus on those renewables. But one thing, and it's slightly controversial, is I would say to use nuclear in the meantime. It doesn't emit emissions to the same level as any of the other things that we're currently using, and it's a stopgap that we can use whilst we integrate that renewable technology and are able to solve those technological challenges.
Don't you think the delay to getting nuclear power stations up is a detriment? Like Hinkley Point takes 20 years to finish then.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what scale of time that you're looking at. And it's, I guess one of the things that they did in Germany is, closing a lot of their nuclear, all of their nuclear power plants. It's just kind of putting the right policies in place, maybe not doing that, investing in technology and looking at it for the short, medium and long term. Whereas, if you look at, I think there was a coal power plant reopened even in the UK as well. And I think going to that action is kind of unacceptable when there's so many other options.
This is another thing with nuclear is not just what is encapsulated by the time to construct it and set it up is the embodied everything within it. It's a huge amount of resources, carbon that you don't see in the incremental operation. But hydrogen, I think, is an interesting one that could utilise existing gas infrastructure with with upgrades and provide the gap where renewables are sort of too intermittent to provide the consistent supply. I think nuclear promising, but with the time and the resources, but it depends if hydrogen can get up to speed and really start being supplied.
Yeah, I think hydrogen at the moment is missing a lot in that technology, but I don't know why I keep going back to batteries. They've improved 60% in the past decade. I don't see why, with enough investment, time and people focusing their education towards that direction, maybe taking up or offering more PhDs, that we can't make similar improvements. And, it could be part of the future. And I'd hope to see it there.
Go on.
I wanted to talk about something that I didn't learn about until this summer, which actually really surprised me. But I feel like, I don't know how everyone else feels, but I feel like in the industry we talk a lot about renewables, and in transport everyone talks about how electric cars are the future, and that's how we're going to decarbonise. And I think that's great. But I learned, so when I was at the Y20 over the summer, I learned a lot about from my fellow delegates about critical rare metals, and I think that's something we don't talk enough about, and the other impacts that come from our so-called clean energy, which luckily for us doesn't impact us, but in countries around the world where it's mined, there's so much environmental damage involved in that. But
could you just tell people where these critical rare metals are used and why that would relate to what we're talking about?
Yeah, so the critical rare metals, they're used in the manufacture of a lot of things related to renewables, for example, in solar panels, battery technology, all over the place, hidden in things that we don't even think about. And yeah, I think it's easy for us to talk about it as a clean solution because for us, it's like, okay, there's no emissions and there's a nice solar panel on that house over there. But for someone in like China who has to work in the mines to mine those materials, it could cause cancer, it could affect the air pollution in the area, it destroys their rivers, it destroys the whole villages that they live in. And I think that we need to start talking about how to change that as well. So I know the G20 this year is actually talking about like recycling schemes, which I think are really important to start tackling that. But I think it also links back to like the circular economy aspect and us really needing to think like life cycle picture and not just focus on what we think can help us without looking at the rest of the world and the people actually impacted by what we're doing.
Thank you, Michaela. Cool. I think that brings us to break. So, guys, that is the end of the first session. We are going to have a little break where you can grab some nibbles, network, grab a drink as well, and we'll resume session 2 at 8:15. But a quick reminder, if you guys do have any questions, please note them down, or even if you want to say them, make sure you make a note of them because there'll be a mic passed around at the Q&A session, and that's at the end of session 2. Brilliant. See you in half an hour. about the jacket's come off, by the way, so we're getting serious in this session too. But welcome back. We are going to dive into some more questions with the panelists for probably 25 minutes now. And remember, if you guys have any questions, I've had a few submissions already, but we're going to get a mic passed round when it comes to the Q&A in session. So get thinking if you want your questions answered. Okay, so our next question is, are we actually reducing carbon emissions, or are we just transferring this carbon elsewhere in the world or project cycle? E.g., are low emission zones saving the day, or are they just moving the problem elsewhere? That's an interesting question. Cameron, I'm going to jump straight to you on this one.
Okay, I'm going to start with, again, something very civil and talk about cement replacement. So a common sort of easy win with a concrete specification at the moment is to specify a very high GGBS replacement, ground granulated blast furnace slag. That though it's a material that comes as a waste product from steel production, which has a limited supply and is only, if you're doing your account for where you're using your concrete, as it's a waste product, it's deemed zero carbon, but that GGBS actually has a limited supply globally, and at the moment it's a very sort of common thing that really, in terms of GGBS, it is the best thing you can do to BS 8500 now to reduce your carbon footprint in concrete specifications. But that is a limited material where I think if you're specifying above about 25%, it's pretty well understood. You're just taking it off another project that would otherwise have used it. And particularly in the UK, there's quite a big demand for it, with a lot of push on projects to reduce carbon footprints of concrete mixes. So at a lot of projects in the UK, as I say, I think most of it we're just trading that saving from someone else or somewhere else that could have used it. And I think that happens for quite a decent selection of materials. But yeah, happy to throw out, because I think, in terms of offsets, that's another one where it may seem that if you buy a flight and you offset your carbon, you sort of, it might make the purchase a bit more emotionally easy if you're carbon conscious. But at the moment, most offsets work by investing in someone else avoiding an emission, which they would have probably done anyway. So it is a little bit of trading. So I think to avoid it, the key is to be informed about supply chain and where you're getting material from, I guess, to try and avoid that problem.
Thank you. Any other suggestions? Yes, Toby at the end.
Hope this works. Yeah. All right. So to add to that, I would say we are actually reducing carbon emissions. There is the issue of offsets, and it's a pretty big issue, but I think it's one that at the moment is getting quite a bit of attention in terms of looking at better ways to offset what we can't reduce. But there are current methodologies and current actions to actually reduce emissions. That, for example, in terms of construction, reducing embodied carbon. It's not just in terms of offsetting, but you can reduce embodied carbon by reducing the type of fuel that is used in construction sites by choosing different materials. So there are certain ways in which carbon is being reduced, but then at the moment it usually leaves quite a bit to still be offset, and that's where a lot of work still needs to be done. The offsetting can be done in better ways through offsetting in your own value chain. So instead of, like you said, instead of paying for someone else to avoid emissions that they probably would have avoided anyway, if you have quite a robust supply chain, you can invest in offsetting based on your own supply chain or based on your own activities. And I think it's a term called insetting. So I would say it's much better to try to do that as opposed to paying for someone else to avoid emissions. But then there are ways in which carbon is being reduced. It's just to do better in terms of offsetting.
I'll just add on to that. I think those are good points, but I think paying someone else to reduce emissions isn't always a bad thing, because the money's still going in the right direction and being invested into the right areas. And depending on what the group does with that money, you have potential to generate further carbon savings and carbon offsetting.
I think we might talk about offsets later, but I think we're getting quite caught up on it. But I think it's quite a cop-out for a lot of projects that see it as a way to almost buy themselves out of really making the hard yards and taking the responsibility to really revamp their operations or their designs, when a lot of it's a very unconservative approach that these emissions are, from your investment of offsetting, are not immediately offset. They may be investing in sort of programs in the future that could develop carbon capture. It's a huge assumption that these things will be done, and sort of gives them the impression that they can carry on their operations and emit more and more and more. So I think it's a very difficult, sort of not a very responsible way to be doing, but sort of programs can let companies get away with it at the moment to sort of net zero their emissions very simply.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I guess to answer the question, are we actually reducing them? I think offsetting is another challenge, but if we look at cars right now, the number of electric cars on the roads, in other countries such as Norway, where the uptake of electric cars is absolutely massive, I think that's quite a clear reduction in emissions, and maybe there are some challenges to look at within the supply chain, but overall, I think carbon emissions have been reduced.
If on the cars, again, in some countries, maybe Norway, other European countries with very low carbon intense grids, electric cars, very effective, but others, maybe Australia, China, with very coal heavy carbon grids, you're directly transferring the emissions from the nozzle to the factory, or to the plant providing the grid. In a similar way that the UK transition to a service-based industry from a manufacturing industry, our emissions reduced hugely, but we just sent it to China, and we get everything from there. And sort of one way, when you look at the global picture of emissions, they're going up and up and up, and a lot of it is from China, and people point the blame at China and other countries like India, and thinking, they need to sort themselves out, but we're the ones buying things from them, causing them to emit, and we buy them from them because they're the cheapest, and they're the cheapest because they use coal. And so it's a very, I don't think our emissions are reducing. We are pushing them away from our own responsibility in the UK, countries like that. So I think there needs to be more responsibility for your full scope, like your scope 3 emissions, things that happen outside your operations. You need to, the best way is if we're accountable for our scope 3, but that doesn't align with the Paris Agreement, which says you need to be responsible from your scope 1 and 2. And so there's a misalignment, but we can't pull out the Paris Agreement because then we're all going to lose faith and nothing's going to happen.
Thank you, guys. Michaela, you had something to add?
Yeah, I think touching on, so I interpreted this question quite differently to everyone else, I think. I was thinking more on like the global level, like the emissions trading system that the EU has, which kind of like what you guys are saying about transferring like the right to emit from one company to another, but like for countries. And I think similar to your point about us just moving our emissions to China, I completely agree it's important to have scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So for those of you who don't know, scope 3 emissions are like everything earlier in the supply chain that we don't really talk about because it's hard to calculate. And I think it's really important we start measuring that, but also that we start taxing carbon, because emissions trading systems are, as everyone has been saying, just enabling us to just move the emissions somewhere else, which doesn't really help us to actually reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting and to reduce the emissions. But having a carbon tax, I think that would actually cause reductions in emissions, and as well, like that would be an additional source of income for governments, which could actually be used to help address like historic inequalities in climate change due to just like historically in different different legacies of emissions.
Yes, Toby.
Just continuing on that, the example that's actually giving here, the low emission zones, I think is a really good example of a stick, if you will, that can be used to actually reduce emissions. So low emission zones have led to a significant reduction, I would say, in emissions. For example, the nitrous oxide emissions, I think, have been reduced by about half since its inception, up until pre-pandemic levels. So, I, in this case, struggle to see where those emissions are being pushed somewhere else. So, for example, in those ultra-low emission zones, these are opportunities for people to perhaps get vehicles that aren't so prone to emitting so much emissions, or to use public transportation, which actually helps to reduce those emissions. So, those are some of those actions or activities that actually help to reduce emissions. And I think this example really does work well for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a good discussion, guys. So, to what extent should we limit development through the lens of sustainability? What priority should sustainability have in the initial stages of design and project development? Should it be prioritized as high as safety does? I'm going to Michaela with that one first, please.
So I wanted to clarify what we mean by development, because I think development has a lot of...
If we were to take it in terms of a structural development, or maybe like a civil engineering project, maybe.
Okay, I mean, I think we do need to change the way that we think about sustainability. I think as engineers, we like to think of innovations that we can make and new technologies that we can develop, but sometimes the best thing we can do is just not build, which is the worst thing to say that you did as a civil engineer. Once I had to present a case study on what I did to reduce carbon, I said I did nothing, and I got laughed out of the room, and I had no slides to show because I didn't do anything on the project. And I saved the client thousands of pounds and nothing happened. But I think that should be more of what we're doing, and we should be looking at retrofitting buildings instead of building new ones. And but also, like, I was having a really good discussion with someone in the audience about like actually looking at cost-benefit analysis of like sometimes we are doing the same thing over and over again, and there are more innovative ways of doing it, and we need to start thinking more radically. But I think one of the questions is about if sustainability should be prioritized as high as safety. Mm-hmm. And I think when we talk about safety, it's always health, safety, and well-being. But we focus a lot on health and safety because I think that is the status quo for the industry, and it's been something that's really drilled into us, but we don't really talk about well-being as much. And sustainability and well-being are like intrinsically linked. So yeah, we talk a lot about sustainability, and it is one of these words that is so hard to define, but it is so linked with the livability of the planet and our relationship with nature. And I think that we need to start thinking about that through all the stages of design and project development. Yeah, I feel like I've talked enough, so that's what I was going to do.
No, thank you. I mean, Ollie, you and I were sort of catching up in the break about this kind of idea of before we're starting a construction project, is there the ability to refurb a building? Can you elaborate a bit more on why that should be considered so important?
I think the first beginning of the question saying sustainability may limit development is quite dangerous way to sort of keep the stigma that sustainability will induce this like degrowth, that it's, think we have to sacrifice things to be sustainable, but so many easy wins like refurbishment of buildings are just cost effective in a way that, looking at all of the industries that we waste so much, we're so inefficient with resources, and that also means we lose value with buildings if we, the traditional viewpoint of we demolish a building and replace it with a more energy efficient one is so dated, because so much of it does not need to be thrown away. We can retrofit at low resource addition, low cost, with many other sustainability strategies. So use of timber, leaner structures, all these things are more sustainable and we can develop. So I think it's just need to be decouple sort of development from not sustainability. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can add on to that. I guess from my perspective as a manufacturing production quality engineer, when we look at our products, and a lot of products people have, I don't know around the room how many people have bought a new phone in like the past 2 years? Anyone? But I imagine maybe not people in this room because they're quite conscious, but a lot of people, yeah, my point didn't work. But a lot of people, or a lot of phones are designed to fail or need an update or need to be replaced after a couple of years. It's not a sustainable design, and that impacts you. The newest iPhone costs over £1,000, and it impacts everyone. So by focusing on sustainability, you're not always limiting development. You can actually improve things, improve your living, improve your experiences. and have things that actually work to survive and that don't need to be replaced so often and contribute to the poor climate.
Thank you. Cameron?
Yeah, I wanted to add in terms of the limiting development through the lens of sustainability, I would sort of put out that PAS 2080 has a very effective carbon management hierarchy where the first step and most effective step is building nothing. And it's something that when certified to it, which National Highways and Network Rail will force all their supply chains to have by 2023, 2024, that has to be considered on every job. And if it's not you, through the, working under the PAS, you have to show evidence of where you've challenged the brief to consider building nothing. So I think certainly that framework is there, and in terms of managing emissions, it is the most effective thing we can do if we can build nothing. I'm surprised that you got laughed out of the room. Maybe it was a bit too early in the piece, but I think if there are a lot of the awards that go out for big infrastructure when we build projects, the ICE structure is a good example that they're moving away from the big and the tall. They're going to minimum impact. The building nothing is starting to win awards. And also just in terms of the one treating as high as safety does, again, the ICE structure I think is pushing the curve on this one in that they explicitly say that it is. So within their entrance exam from next year, it will include a carbon management related aspect that every engineer trying to get chartered with the ICE structure will have to demonstrate competence in doing a carbon calc and suggesting ways to reduce it in their schemes that they propose.
Fantastic. Thank you. Any more to add? Toby, yes.
Yeah, so just to look at that last question, if sustainability should be prioritized as high as safety, I would really go with what Michaela said. Sustainability and safety are intrinsically linked. Safety does come under sustainability, and so to answer that question, yes, it should be prioritized as high as safety is. In relation to the first question, I think with the kind of society that we live in now, it is good that we are starting to prioritize that build nothing mentality. But in order to, it seems still that in order to improve the quality of living, developments and things have to be manufactured, things have to be done, services have to be provided, and activity has to still happen. And what we should focus on is how we can incorporate sustainability into those activities to make sure that those things that would inevitably still happen. For example, iPhone 15 will come out next year. So those things that will inevitably happen, how do you incorporate sustainability and make sure that it's embedded into everything that we do? For decades and decades now, any real capital project, for any capital project, you have to do an environmental impact assessment. That's usually the basic thing. But then things have improved to really look at a robust collection of metrics and things that you have to consider before you decide to build something. Before you decide to take on the manufacturing of a product, or before you decide to provide a certain service. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on, because development will happen anyway.
Thank you. Really, really good point there, Toby.
I just think in terms of as well the early priority, it's just like you said, early engagement, having the conversation straight away with the client, so that they may not be aware, but they are aware of the impacts of their development. Just because then, as early as possible, it is the cheapest point and the easiest point to make the biggest decisions. Otherwise, further down the line, a scheme or detailed, there's so difficult, you're constrained. So yeah, early engagement is cheap and big impact, so I'd say, yeah.
Thank you.
Very important.
Thank you. Our next question was referring back to carbon offsets, but I think we tackled that, unless any of our panellists would like anything further to add to what extent can carbon offsets be used to mitigate the climate problem. But I think we're all covered there. Yeah, let's get some new content. Okay, so
I'll keep it till later.
Are you sure? We could do it if you want.
I was just going to drop in offsetting the Oxford principles of offsetting, or Oxford offsetting principles, that try to define quite a useful hierarchy of what is a good offset and what isn't what's a bad offset. And they link to if you're really just helping someone avoid their emissions, or if your offset directly takes carbon out of the atmosphere or from a process directly? And if so, how long is it stored and how robust is the storage? So that's probably the only thing that I would say is worth a read before like wading into that, because I think, as we covered before, it's sometimes seen as too easy an out. And, you know, one offset is not the same as another when you start to think about those sort of principles.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I know certainly from my friends who are wanting to sort of choose a more sustainable option, they would obviously look for something like an offset, but I don't know how deep they look into that. So if you're encouraging people to sort of make wise, sustainable choices, then get into deeper what they're actually offsetting and compare those options.
Well, probably the thing with offsets is because they're so readily and enthusiastically used.
Exactly.
Is that they should always be the last. It should be the last possibility after every other feasible design option has been pursued and proven that can't work. Maybe it's viable or not. Then you can maybe pursue it after you've done everything else to reduce, because it's almost the least certain way of reducing emissions. Well, maybe if you know your hierarchy, if you know what your offset is, you may have more certainty, but compared to design optioneering and things, it's just, very contentious, I think, to use them.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a really good discussion in this session, so we're probably going to have to jump to our last question before we open it up to the Q&A session. So this is to everyone, by the way. This isn't for anyone specifically, so please jump in. What can industries realistically do now to see an impact on the environment? So we have mentioned a few things here and there, but if you guys can give us your quick summary that you think companies, I know Cameron, quick summary. If I could do that, I'd say all the problems
do we have
in the world.
45 minutes still?
But yeah, if you have any options or things that you think are going to make it better for companies to broadcast that. Toby, I see you reaching for the mic.
So I would say the first thing I would encourage businesses to do, if at all they are actually listening to me, would be to go beyond mandatory reporting requirements. So there are those mandatory reporting requirements for you to report on your carbon emissions, or policies that mandate, maybe for example the inclusion of biodiversity net gain in whatever you're planning to develop. To go beyond that into more voluntary reporting and voluntary actions that not just show that you're actually doing something, but actually contribute to the goal of net zero carbon, and by so doing also improves your reputation as an organization. Helps, if you're doing the right thing, helps to actually reduce cost, improve revenue, if you're an organization that actually knows what you're doing, and overall basically just helps the environment. But it's essentially to go beyond just that mandatory requirement by the government and do things on their own, take the initiative in ways that they can within their own context.
Thank you. Being proactive and giving more clarity. I like that. Thanks, guys. Paul?
I'll go on next, because I think mine kind of leads on from the same principles. But I think when you look at industries and on the larger scale, reducing the impact on the climate, collaboration is probably the biggest factor that you can do. Everything kind of stems down falling from collaboration. So I'd really like industries to be fully open with their data, how they calculate their emissions, how they work out, how they reduce it, technologies that they're investing in, and kind of the results that come out of that. I know there's intellectual property, but I just think by going forward with collaboration and being open with your books, and it helps out the supply chain when you look at how much emission am I actually getting from this product that I might be manufacturing, or where is it moving forward. I really think collaboration is the way forward.
Mm-hmm. And clarity to achieve that, to sort of demonstrate that other companies are doing it too. So this is the way forward. Yeah. Cool. Anyone else?
I'll say maybe similarly to collaboration, awareness, education. Educate your client on the project ahead, their impact, what can be done easily. If nothing can be done. Make your workforce aware. Lots of engineers are really talented. They have the skill set to design sustainably. they have everything they need, they just may not be aware about the principles and why and when to apply them. I think this country, especially London, is getting really good at collaborating and educating on sustainability in the built environment. So it just needs more and more to really normalise it across the industry, so we can get more favourable long-term policies. Maybe could really be embedded and get more development.
Thank you. Cool. Right. Anything else?
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah, go for it, Michaela.
Along slightly different lines to everyone else, I'm a big fan of symbolism, and I think that the ICE and the IET and other institutions of all industries, they really set the tone for those industries, even if they don't themselves do the work that the companies and stuff do. And last week, or whenever it was that we had our last ICE GNS meeting, they were describing civil engineering, the 1828 Charter for the ICE, which describes civil engineering as the art of directing the great sources of power in nature for the use and convenience of man, which when you read it nowadays sounds really, really outdated. And I know it's a symbolic thing, but I think that institutions need to start redefining their charters and redefining the roles that we all have in society. And I think by symbolically changing those, you can encourage a complete change in mindset in how everyone takes their individual responsibility to actually make a difference.
Thank you. I love that. Yeah, I mean, starting to see that even on a smaller scale, just with my organisation, that now setting objectives for individuals to start being more sustainable. How can you come up with creative, innovative solutions that are going to help contribute to that? So making it worthwhile and making it part of that value structure. Wonderful. Anything else?
Oh, it's definitely short. Just, I think that keeping it simple and using less stuff, that's something that a lot of the iStructure guidance goes on about. It's just use less stuff. In construction, it's quite an easy thing to do because you're also saving cost. So every client that you ever work for also wants it too. So that's all I got.
Use less stuff. Yeah. There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a quick round of applause for our panellists? Some incredible discussions there. Thank you so much. What a load of brains we've got at the table. Right, so now we're going to go straight into a quick Q&A session, and then we'll have our networking at the end. So do we have any questions from the audience straight away? Anyone got a burning desire to have their question answered? Yep. I'm going to hand you my mic so everyone can hear you.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. Very interesting. This is quite a broad question, but what's the panel's opinion on carbon capture and storage, and should we invest in it?
First, in the latest IPCC report that I think Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change is released, they have a big, nice, colourful chart that states the most common, the most heavily supported mitigation measures of climate change in terms of energy, industry, buildings, transport. Carbon capture has its own section. The chart is, on the x-axis, is effectiveness, so how much carbon could be captured with this technology, feasibly, and the colour is how much it would cost for that. The carbon capture ones are very short and very red, so they don't seem very feasible on a large scale, and they seem a very expensive way of doing it compared to reducing your emissions through the demand side or changes to renewables, sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree on the points made there. Definitely reduce first, reduce emissions, focus on renewables. But I do think that there is a space for carbon capture. I think it's more of a broadly long-term thing. But I think we need to continue to invest in it. Maybe not as much as we are in renewables and reducing emissions and education, but there's definitely a place for it, and to not forget that as well.
All right, I'll go, sorry. I just wanted to paraphrase the article The Guardian put out maybe a week ago, I'm not sure if anyone else read it, that they did a review of 13 large-scale carbon capture projects. I might get the facts wrong, but I think the 13 represented 2/3 of what was in operation currently. 8 of them were just completely not successful. 1 was never finished, and another one I think has had problems that actually got it started. So the track record at the moment is poor, but it is something new, and with that comes risk, and we have to learn how to do things more effectively. So I think, again, it has a place, but it's certainly not something to wait around for, to carry on doing what we're doing to get us out.
I would take the opinion that it is something I think that should still be invested in. There's a significant amount of research still being done on carbon capture and storage. I know so many PhD students that have gotten funding based on that alone. I think, according to research, still the most effective way to take away carbon from the atmosphere, in theory. And I believe that with the right amount of investment and research in this, eventually at a certain point, even though we know we shouldn't definitely rely on it at this point, but at a certain point, I believe that it will reach the point of technical and financial viability. And once that happens, I think it would show itself as a really good measure for taking carbon out of the atmosphere and being able to store it and put it away.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your question. Yes, we're coming over here.
Thank you very much. You didn't speak very much of transport except for the electrical vehicles, which I find interesting. However, this is the country of EasyJet and also Ryanair. And what about rebalancing this country with more railways, with finally the same level of high-speed railways as everywhere else? I mean, on the continent, in China or anywhere, you find high-speed railways. In this country, because someone owns a territory where they want to hunt, you cannot have a high-speed train. This is crazy. And people, when they go on holidays, they don't think about taking a train because it's lousy, it's expensive, and it's bad. Whereas they fly, which, of course, throws through the roof the carbon emission.
I'll start with that one, because in transport infrastructure, the user's utilization of what you build in that sort of transport network generally over the lifetime of a bridge will far outweigh the expenditure put in. So there is a part to think when planning an improvement or a road improvement or a new railway about the saving in a mode shift or a shorter route if you're talking only about driving. Again, I think the sort of shift towards electric vehicles that is supported within the government's decarbonisation transport plan is not something to ignore. So I don't think making a route 5 minutes quicker in a 15-minute drive the benefit cost will really stack up if in a carbon sense if there is more electric vehicles. But the mode you mentioned, like aviation, seems then probably someone else is much better informed, but it seems very difficult to decarbonise. I'm not really sure if there's a very clear plan that doesn't involve intense carbon capture and storage to keep aviation running as it currently does. So yeah, I'll just end on that.
I agree. I think it's one of in all of the decarbonisation scenarios to net zero, every industry goes down, but then aviation goes up as the sort of middle class grows, and you struggle to get. I think hydrogen is what they're talking about, but like it's a real struggle. You can't get rid of it. So I think that becomes. I think the thing is, if we do reach net zero in this country, with all the other industries down, like really down to the percents, aviation will be like 50%. But then, if the magnitude on total is down, then it's maybe not the worst thing, but definitely a hard to abate industry that, probably the biggest thing will be behavioural. How many holidays can you go on? How many you might have mile taxes and more flight taxes and things like that. But on the smaller scale, railways, cars, maybe more down to urban planning, more 15-minute cities in place, no need for cars. You can pedestrianise places where all the social amenities you need are within walking distance or cycling distance. London's become a lot more of a cycling city, which is good. Hopefully more in the future in other cities, but places like America where it's built for cars will be tricky.
I'll just add on to that one a bit. I think in this country it's absolutely crazy if I wanted to travel to Scotland, it's cheaper for me to get a flight than it is to get a train. I think a lot of what's forgotten in government policies, especially when we come to like public transport, is the keyword public. I think that the cost should be offset by the amount of carbon impact it has. I don't want to feel financially it only makes sense if I grab a flight when there's an option where I can massively reduce my carbon costs by getting the train, and that's something that really needs to be informed by the government. And I know we've got some people maybe like working in the rail industries on this table around the room, and yeah, not to pass on the blame. I studied aerospace engineering as well, so I'm a little bit on that one too.
To probably like half the civil engineering industry in the country.
I think it's pretty much down to political will and financial investment. The initial capital expenditure for proper high-speed railway would be immense, and to be able to justify that to the public, for a lot of these politicians is incredibly difficult. Who's going to pay for it? How long is it going to take? And so, I think that's really just what it is. People find it difficult to really think about the carbon that you would eventually save once it's done. So the main barrier, I would say, would be that initial capital outlay and the political will. If anyone is willing to try to push something like that through, especially within the UK, it's really a lot of it really is down to, in terms of transport, those electric vehicles, and not just cars, but looking at trucks as well, and then also finding a miracle to try to decarbonize aerospace or airline industry. Yeah.
Great question. Thank you. Do we have a question back there? Brilliant. I'm going to hand you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Just so I don't let this go long and winding. I've heard a lot about the different vectors that can help with climate change, sustainability. And one of the things I want to hear from the panelists is, what do you think is the intersection between different key players? And I'll just narrow this to the 4 key players. So government, who are in charge of policy, maybe who puts the money forward, big business, we think about research and development or higher education institutions, and lastly, the social enterprises. What do you think is that intersection amongst all of them in actually addressing the net zero challenge that we have?
That's a good question.
If I could start on that, I would say things definitely begin with the government. It's important for the government itself to set the pace on, what is beneficial for the environment or what is beneficial for citizens, and it is incumbent on the government as well to sell that idea to the people. And then following that, the government will provide funding for research. That's where academic and research institutions then come in, who in essence are there to take on ideas, just ideas, and then try to build them up into things that can show some form of technical viability. And that's where you get to different TRL levels. Big business then comes in, I think, from there to try to scale those technologically feasible or technically feasible technologies, to try to scale them to make them more financially feasible, make them more available to the wider public. And what was the last branch that you mentioned? Social enterprises. I'd say social enterprises, I think, come in all around those 3 different other players to try to, first of all, educate the wider public and try to make sure that those technologies are available to those who are not able to initially get access to those technologies or get access to those activities or processes, if you will. So with my own 2 cents, I think that's where those different 4 different vectors do come in.
Thank you, Toby.
Yeah, okay. I think I'd say a good example of these like 4 working together in recent times would be the circular economy in London. And so an idea, you know, the idea from the top down that the London plan has told all big building projects that they have to have a circular economy statement as a planning submission has really pushed through from the top down. Big businesses need to start thinking about it. We now have social enterprises within London providing guidance for big and small and medium-sized enterprises, and then research, obviously doing a lot of work on the best ways to do this stuff. And so I think this is something that's been, the industry wanted it, they knew it was the best thing, but difficult on projects when it's not perceived as the most cost-effective. And so with government to sort of make that mandate, it's really forced it down the whole system, where, you know, other industry voluntary agreements haven't quite had the same impact. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ollie.
I was just going to come in with one point in a Henderson colloquium that the IABC hosted a couple of years ago, looking at procurement of new infrastructure with respect to carbon. They had representatives from government, big business and contractors and researchers. And I think they really struggled to find where they could all get behind and push in the same direction. And I'd say, you know, finding the good examples and working out how they worked so well is probably the best way to do it. Because one thing that really stuck with me off the back of it was there was quite a senior person from the Treasury in the colloquium. They said, look, it's so refreshing to hear from contractors and things about how you actually work and operate your businesses, because when they engage with the supply chain, it's very much transactional. They say, this is our budget and this is what we want. And then the contractor goes away and then they build it and come back, and there's sometimes some arguments, but it's very transactional. So the big takeaway to try and remove that was that person from Treasury said, look, we could write a policy in the next week and try and push it out, but we don't know if you're ready yet. So the main thing from that was to break down those barriers and to really collaborate across those industries and communicate in a way they hadn't previously when it comes to delivering carbon sort of heavy things.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
So this is kind of coming back to something Paul said. So the concept of having like a sustainable mobile phone, I think it's just common thing where like in 4 years' time you'd have to replace your mobile phone, and the only reason I'm not doing it is because I'm stubborn. But my question would be, well, this is kind of up to individual companies, but how would you kind of incentivize this, since there is like a possibility of losing money or not making enough money?
I'll start with that. Yeah, incentivizing. I try and look at other examples. So I guess I spoke about the iPhone, but you look at most other phones that use Android. I think it was an EU regulation that's made us all use the same charger. That's regulation driven, and it's forced companies to adapt in a way that makes them more usable. You can reuse the same charger. You don't have to buy a different one for each new phone. So I think that's one way it can come through from regulation. As for the other part of it, I think it kind of comes from like a drive from the consumer, which is everyone inside of this room, maybe not on phones, but on other products. If you are looking for a water bottle that is more sustainable, we can push industry and companies to develop them in that direction.
Sorry, no, I keep interrupting, you go.
Okay, I don't know if you've seen, I think it's California, that has made it like a consumer right to repair. And I think that should be a right everywhere, just for the sake of the circular economy. And the idea is basically that everyone should be able to repair their phone. I don't know if you've heard of the Fairphone, but that's a phone that's just been designed so that you can repair it yourself. You can get the parts. It's not a great phone, but it's repairable. And I think having phone designs and other designs like that, I think it needs to come from like the government side of enforcing the right to repair, but also from the design side of thinking like, how can I build this in a way that means that consumers can repair it? So I think there's the drive from those two sides, plus the consumer side of wanting to repair it. Yeah.
basically the same point. I was just going to say the EU brought in regulation to say that if you had a product that had a warranty period of over a certain amount of time, you now have to provide the facility to supply spare parts. So I think regulation's the best lever at the moment, and it is, you know, leading to genuinely better things, just like the same example.
Just to move towards the carrot side of things, and this I'm not sure about this being the perfect example, but, you know, going back to the Apple thing, if you're able to market your product well enough, you can reduce your carbon footprint by a significant amount and sell essentially the same product while reducing its features. So, for example, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, Apple decided to take away the charger head. And they did significantly reduce their carbon footprint, but, you know, they're still selling the phone at the same price. You know, and you would now have to, you know, actually go and buy the charger head on its own if you want to. But, you know, if you're able to, as an organization, market a product well enough, you know, you can actually find ways to still make money while reducing your carbon footprint. And Apple is a really good example of that.
A similar approach that sort of stems from like right to repair, from the principle of extended producer responsibility. So you have your regulation side, and then there are more carrot sides, as Paul was saying. Similar to in buildings, product service systems. So looking at building products in a whole new procurement way. So you're essentially, you rent the lighting as a service. You rent your carpet tiles, you rent your wall lining, so that the supplier has a incentive to maintain the quality, to take them, to recycle them, to maximize the value they retain and minimize the waste. So really making the whole supply chain a lot more efficient as a service. But, you know, there are a whole loads of different types of that sort of service type. So it could be 20-year warranty on a product, or it could just be a renting sort of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, one more from the audience, then I have one up there as well. So there you go.
Thank you for a very nice discussion. A quick jump in about the public transportation. Probably we have heard about the €9 tickets in German, that it reduced significantly about the carbon emission. And first question is, what is your perspective on that? And is it applicable in UK especially, or in other country? And that is my first question. The second question is related to the build nothing perspective, especially for the consultant experts. How do you address and convince in more practical way two teams, especially the clients? Because when the clients came to us, they probably think that it's feasible to build this because they have some feasibility studies, financial studies before they came to us. And the second one is within our company, like business development teams within our company. How do we address and convince both stakeholders? Thank you.
Different questions. I'll start with the second one, because there's a couple of really good examples that are, again, being celebrated more and more. I think as a consultant, when you step into a role, there is a balance. You can't go back to the client and say, look, we know you've done all these preliminary studies, but we want to go back and convince you not to build anything. So I think being cognizant of where a project is and the client's desire to build something, you know, they've obviously convinced themselves that it's important enough to invest the money if you're getting involved at that late stage. But I think we shouldn't ignore that requirement at all. And a good example is a recent study done at one of the London airports. I can't remember which. It's in one of the iStruct documents I've read again recently, where they hired a consultant to build them a new car park. And the consultant actually, sort of through some early dialogue, was able to go back and look at the demand driving the requirement for a new multi-storey car park. And they actually, instead of providing services for a new car park, they convinced them to change their timetable for aircraft flying in to avoid the peak that needed the car park at all, and then they never built it. they just changed the timetable for aircraft coming in. Like that's obviously, again, an extreme example where you'd have to have a very good client relationship to be able to go in and say, you know, are you sure you're right? Are you sure you really need it? But I'd say that it's becoming more incumbent on all parts of the value chain, you know, providing services to reconsider that.
You know, as a consultant, your job may not necessarily be to, as purely design, like you are an advisor for the client's best sort of outcomes, and that could a lot of the time be the more conservative thing for their cost is to just, you know, do nothing. And I'll say again, in terms of buildings, the issue is over and over again we're faced with is, hi, I'm a client, I want to demolish this building and build a new one. And it's like, it could save you a lot of money and you could deliver the same outcome for quicker program, less construction cost if you just don't. And so a lot of the time, yeah, just thinking about what is best for them, and they are immediately on board when they understand the cost and the program implications.
Yeah, I can add on to that just a little bit. I'm not a consultant, but I've worked as a quality engineer for some time, and in there you're always looking at continuous improvement. But one of the things that took me a while to realise is sometimes you can look back, find a root cause before you make your corrective action. If you start to try and change things at the end, that usually adds on more cost, both financially and inside of your carbon emission. But if you actually go back to the root cause, you can actually save a lot by eliminating.
Thank you. Do you feel like both your questions got answered there? Yeah. All your questions.
Tickets or something in Germany? I was like, yeah, we'd love that.
German trains. I went to Germany, and I swear trains were like hundreds of euros.
I think they put it on for like a month, didn't they?
It was a cost of living thing recently when the fuel prices were really high. I'm going to Germany tomorrow by train, and it's not €8, I can guarantee you. I think maybe the one point I do remember from the question is, you know, why can perhaps other places do it and not here? I think from the railway industry in the UK, it is a lot of it's privately run. So I think the government loses its control to step in and control fares like it does in other countries. So that's probably maybe one of the aspects that restrict those sorts of extreme ticket reductions where they would be running at a loss, but because it's a government-owned railway, that they don't mind. You know, they're doing it for the good of the people.
Depends on the industry culture. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and like the people there, and you know how they're used to like operating with each other. If it's more socialist rather than capitalist, I don't know. Yeah, we could get very philosophical.
Someone's got to pay for it, and if the priority of the government is to subsidise railway, they might be busy subsidising a lot of other stuff, national healthcare, others. So, you know, is this the priority right now? Maybe not at the moment, but yeah.
I think it should be.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one more question to run through that was submitted earlier, and we'll round off on this one and get into our networking and maybe a cup of tea. You've done really, really well, panelists. Thank you so much. So your last question, how do you think we can get people to focus more on the long-term costs and benefits of government policy when voting? How can we encourage people to act in their own self-interest in regards to government and the environment?
So at my work, I'm a union member, and I've done quite a lot on that side, kind of encouraging and educating people. And I really think it is about that education. Mm-hmm. It's about having these open forums, events like this one we're all at, where people are able to discuss, make points, challenge each other's opinions, and really get to the root cause of why you might have a disagreement. I think sometimes a statement might come out and it can be interpreted in different ways. But when you have this open forum discussion, you can really move forward.
Thank you.
I think the citizens' assembly type approach can work really well with these longer term ambitions. There's a good documentary that was done where they took a group of people from different aspects and specifically looked at trying to help people make better carbon decisions to improve their lifestyle as well as improving the environment. And that style of approach, I think, is maybe one tool that is not used as well as it should, where you can have these citizen assemblies where they come in and they come up with a policy from the people going to the government rather than the government to the people.
Love that.
Just to add, there are these, like you mentioned, citizen groups, but groups that actually try to bridge the gap between, for example, research or government and the people on the ground, especially within rural areas. There are those organizations that try to do that to basically try to digest what the policy that's being put out is, try to organize those citizen forums and make sure that the people that are going to be affected actually understand what is actually going to be happening. And I think the proliferation of those types of citizen groups is essentially needed, to help people to understand, what it is that the government or research is actually trying to put out, which would be in the long term better for people, but which they just probably don't understand that it will.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, one final round of applause for our wonderful panelists today, please. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your insightful comments. I feel like I have learned a huge amount. I'm going to have to think about and watch this back, because honestly, it's been really, really incredible to share this table with you. Now, we are going into a network session, so feel free to help yourself to tea and coffee and network. Grab our panelists if you have any further questions, but it's been a great evening. Thank you, guys.